Please be seated. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God. I must confess that I feel a bit ill-prepared. The gospel reading that was read is not what I have written a sermon on, but that's okay. I'll be brief. The gospel reading which I wrote a sermon on is still familiar to many of you. It is, "Take my yoke upon you," and you know the rest. So tonight we're going to hear about yokes. A yoke is a type of harness that has traditionally been used to link livestock together to enable them to use maximum force when pulling a load, plowing a field, or some other type of arduous work. It's used to harness energy and to direct it in a specific direction for a specific need. It is an implement of labor. It was a familiar term in both the Old and New Testament. Both would have understood a yoke as a domineering and harsh means of oppression. Sirach chapter 40, verse 1 says, quote, "Hard work was created for everyone, and a heavy yoke is laid upon the children of Adam," end quote. This is representative of the heavy yoke of daily life that the Hebrew people were under. For them, it was live life under the totalitarian Roman rule. People could live under the law of the land and the yoke of Roman rule, or the yoke of Yahweh and live by the law of the Torah. Both Old and New Testament cultures would also have understood the meaning that the yoke held in the justice system. It was a symbol for equity and justice in the courts. Thus, when someone like Jesus claimed to be a Messiah, a yoke was seen as what he would provide in terms of justice and fairness as a ruler. We think of a yoke in metaphoric terms and imagine it as something heavy, hard to bear, and maybe even oppressive. We call it a burden. There are many burdens that we face daily which weigh us down. It could be some part of a job, a family situation, an illness, the stress of schoolwork, better yet, the stress of being a seminarian parent or spouse or being the child of a seminarian. These burdens are all very real. They make a difference in how we approach our day and live our lives. A yoke can also be understood as a duty, such as obeying the Torah. So, instead of the oppressive yoke of rulers, the yoke that is taken on is that of serving God. It is an essential part of the invitation of Christ to come. God's people, rather than the oppressive yoke of daily life, receive a yoke of a call to follow. Jesus' call of "take my yoke upon you" is not an invitation to escape what pains, burdens, or is hard. He never promises to remove that yoke. What he does promise is to join us in that despair, in that pain, and in that struggle. Jesus does not abolish the law of Scripture, as has often been argued. He calls us to follow, to unite, and to reclaim the covenantal relationship with God. He is binding himself to us. Many of us will be wearing one of these not too long from now. If you're not one who will be wearing one, no doubt you are close to one who will be. A stole is a type of yoke. A minister wears a stole as a symbol of their job in leading God's people in worship. The word stole is Latin, if I'm not incorrect. It refers to an outer garment which hangs to the ankles, and its roots are from the Jewish tallit, or prayer mantle. And possibly, some would say, it has its beginnings in the philosopher's mantle as well. The minister's stole, in many ways, is akin to the yoke of Jesus. It is a physical symbol of a minister's binding with Christ. Today, we do celebrate St. Francis of Assisi. Though I'm told it is doubtful that he wore a stole, he is nonetheless an example of someone who took the yoke of Christ and wore it faithfully. Francis was the son of a prominent cloth merchant from Assisi. His youth was filled with frivolity and unsuccessful attempts to win military glory. Though it was not very important to him at the time, Francis had quite a few encounters with the poor and the sick. Sometime later, while imprisoned, during one of his military excursions, he became ill and had a terrible fever. During his recovery, he began to understand that his revelry and search for military fame was not what he had been designed for. Shortly after, with great opposition from his father, I might add, Francis took a vow of poverty and developed a monastic order that we now know as the Franciscan order. It grew rapidly, and Francis had a hard time controlling it because his rule of absolute poverty. There were few other rules. Francis spent much of his life in mission, proclaiming Christ's word throughout Europe and Africa. It is thought that not long before his death, Francis received the marks of the stigmata on Holy Cross Day. Of all the saints, Francis is considered to be the most popular and widely known. Most people associate the monk with his famed love for nature and animals, and he is often depicted with birds resting in his hands or on his shoulder. In parish life, St. Francis is often celebrated in conjunction with the blessing of the animal service. And if you're interested in such, I do know of 2 services this Sunday. Talk to me later, I'll tell you where. There are various prayers and sayings attributed to St. Francis. Perhaps the most fitting, and one of my favorites, is, "Preach the gospel always. When necessary, use words." One of the most famous legends about Francis is found in the Fiorietti, a composition of legends and folklore about him. The story goes that one day, while Francis was walking on the road with companions, they came to a place with a tree on either side. It was filled with singing birds. Francis stopped and said to his companions, "Wait for me while I go and preach to the birds." The birds surrounded him. They were mesmerized by his power and his voice and his preaching. Not a single one of them flew away. Often, the yoke which has been given to us may not fit so easily, and it may feel very heavy. But we are reminded of the rest which Jesus provides for us. We are reminded that he is holding us up, not only supporting the weight of the yoke, but our weight too. Oh, that we might have the yoke of Christ put upon us and the faithfulness of St. Francis, and not have a single one fly away.